experience.
You're listening to Radio Free North America. I'm your host, J.D. Welton. Today, we're talking about the First, Second, Fifth, and 14th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States and how they're being subverted. In just over 72 days, the United States has become that country. You know, the country that no other countries want to play with. Like that kid in school that all the parents don't want their children to be around. Or that crazy uncle that is ostracized from family gatherings. Actually, I think the crazy uncle analogy might not be too accurate. Maybe it's more like the neighbor down the street that is on the sex offenders registry. Yeah, that might be a better metaphor. In just over 72 days, 10 countries, including Ireland, the Netherlands, Denmark, the United Kingdom, Germany, Finland, and Canada, have updated their travel guidelines for travel to the U.S., cautioning their citizens on visiting our fair shores. This is due to gender identification issues, visa complications, and increased scrutiny on entry, among others. On March 19th, it was reported that a French scientist was denied entry when attempting to attend a conference in Houston. The denial was due to the researcher's phone, which was taken by ICE and reviewed. It contained messages between colleagues and friends where he expressed personal opinions on the Trump administration's research policy. We also have reports of a Russian medical researcher with a legal J-1 scholar visa who earlier protested the Ukraine war and is now in a Louisiana ICE detention facility. There's the Indian national here on a student visa who was detained for close connections to a Hamas official, his father-in-law. That individual has been charged with no crime, and his father-in-law, who left the Gaza government in 2010, eventually started the House of Wisdom in 2011, which promotes peace and conflict resolution in Gaza. There's a doctoral student of Iranian nationality on a student visa here, attending the University of Alabama, who has been detained by ICE for completely unknown reasons. Then there is Mahmoud Khalil, who failed to disclose that he worked for the United Nations Palestinian Refugee Agency. What a crime. He was also involved in the Colombia protests against Israel. He's been detained for deportation despite being a permanent resident of the United States. We have a Turkish national green card holder who was detained by ICE on March 25th for writing an article in the Tufts University School paper saying that Tufts needed to acknowledge the Palestinian genocide. There was, however, a South Korean third-year student at Columbia who has been involved in pro-Palestinian protests, but they successfully received a preemptive block to ICE deportation efforts. There's an assistant professor at Brown University's medical school that was deported to Lebanon despite a court order to the contrary. She was deported for allegedly attending a funeral for a Hezbollah terrorist. There is no proof. And another Indian doctoral student self-deported after her student visa was revoked on March 5th. Her crime, activities supporting Hamas. Yet there were no details to support the claim by DHS officials. A Cornell Ph.D. student was asked to surrender to ICE after his student visa was canceled for, again, supporting a pro-Palestinian movement. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that the State Department has revoked the visas of at least 300 foreign students under a rarely used law, stating that the secretary can deport non-citizens who are, quote, threats to U.S. foreign policy. On April 1st, the Trump administration admitted to mistakenly deporting a Maryland man with protected legal status to a notorious El Salvadorian prison, and now refuses to repatriate him due to alleged but not proven gang ties and a lack of power over El Salvador. The man is married to a U.S. citizen and has worked for many years in the United States to support his family. Their proof that he is a gang member? He was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat and hoodie. And a confidential informant claimed that he was a member of MS-13 in Long Island, despite the fact that he never lived there. Okay, you might be asking yourself, but all of these are non-citizens. Many of these people have said bad things about the United States or its allies. This is what Trump was elected to do. And what does this have to do with me? Well, let's start by talking about the First Amendment. It was enacted with 10 other amendments in 1791, and collectively it's called the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It's just a simple 45 words. But it's 45 words that are clearly in conflict with much of what the Trump administration is currently attempting to do. Again, these are not citizens of the U.S., so the First Amendment does not apply, you might say. But per the Harvard School of Law, like due process rights, First Amendment rights are fundamental rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, without reference to one's citizenship status. If the Trump administration can remove the First Amendment rights of non-citizens, then they can remove a citizen's rights as well. But this is a fundamental right of our Constitution. As an aside, the Second Amendment, right after the first, 1, 2, it's a much ballyhooed cause of the conservative right, reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Both of these are part of the Bill of Rights. You can't have one without the other. And the First Amendment has also been a cause for the right. In 2024, the House voted to protect the First Amendment on campuses, called the End Woke Higher Education Act. Doesn't roll off the tongue. It was a bill to, quote, ensure colleges and universities are not forced to meet diversity, equity, and inclusion standards in order to be accredited, and guarantee that the First Amendment is adhered to on public campuses. Adopted by the Republican National Committee in response to the coronavirus pandemic, their resolution, entitled Resolution Upholding the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America in response to the coronavirus pandemic and the cancel culture movement. They also have in July of 2023, where Chairman Jordan and Senator Paul sponsored the Free Speech Protection Act, which will prohibit executive branch employees and contractors from using their positions to censor and otherwise attack speech protected by the First Amendment. And then there's the 2024 GOP platform, Make America Great Again. Number 7 on their list is Defend Our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and our fundamental freedoms, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to keep and bear arms. What's my point, you might ask? Well, based on what I see, the GOP works on the principle of free speech for me, not for thee. Or to rephrase it, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion are all constitutional rights if they're related to Republican dogma, but not for anything or anyone else. So Trump doesn't like what the press has to say about him? Silence them. His supporters agree with that principle. The administration doesn't like what a French researcher privately says about him. Refuse them entry into our country. The administration doesn't like what a foreign student says about them or their allies. Deport them. If the administration doesn't like what you or I say about Trump, well, what is the answer to that? I suspect that if we don't do something to protect ourselves, we may be more than canceled. We might be disappeared. Another element impacting the above cases is due process. Now, due process is the fundamental principle of fairness in all legal matters, both civil and criminal, especially in the courts. All legal procedures set by statute and court practice, including notice of rights, must be followed for each individual so that no prejudicial or unequal treatment will result. While somewhat indefinite, the term can be gauged by its aim to safeguard both private and public rights against unfairness. The universal guarantee of due process is in the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which provides, quote, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law," and is applied to all states by the 14th Amendment. From this basic principle flows many legal decisions determining both procedural and substantive rights. Abrego Garcia, the man illegally deported to the El Salvadorian prison for being a gang member, did not receive due process. Baydar Khansuri, the Indian national on a student visa who was detained for, quote, "close connections to Hamas," has not received due process. Dr. Rasha Alawi, the assistant professor from Brown University's medical school, did not receive due process. In the U.S., the right to due process, guaranteed by the 5th and 14th Amendments, protects all individuals, including natural persons or human beings, and in some circumstances, artificial persons like corporations, from government actions that could deprive them of, again, life, liberty, or property without due process of law. There are many in the MAGA camp that scream that these individuals are not entitled to due process. The Vice President of the United States actually said that it was, quote, "gross to get fired up," end quote, about Abrego Garcia's case. Right-wing nutjobs on social media, yeah, I should probably find a different term for them, can't seem to differentiate the criminal from the right to due process, attacking when anyone mentions anything contrary to their belief systems. When attempting to explain that Judge James Boasberg was not immediately invalidating the administration's actions under the 1798 Alien Enemies Act, but was only attempting to ensure that the individuals involved received due process under the law, most of the right-wing extremists immediately jumped to alleging that both Boasberg and myself were supporting the gang members. MAGA doesn't equate the loss of rights for some to be a potential loss of rights for all. They expect that anyone that isn't them should be treated however Trump wishes, without realizing that that approach could easily be flipped onto them. Now, earlier, I made mention of our allies and how they're now issuing travel advisories for their citizens while traveling to the United States. But that makes me wonder, let's take a look at just who is still an ally of the United States. Now we have Israel, and they are allies and all in favor of Trump's Gaza land plans, evicting all Palestinians to other unnamed countries and bulldozing Gaza and building a massive Trump-styled resort. Though it hasn't been in the news of late, there is no indication that he's not still envisioning the very much illegal Gaza land for the rich and famous. Well, who else do we have? So, Europe. Well, officially, yes. Yet we're entering into a trade war that includes the European Union and all its member countries. Trump has threatened NATO, and Trump is pushing back against ties with the EU overall. So for all practical purposes, the alliances are tentative at best. Okay, what about the UK and our special relationship? Sir David Manning, the current British ambassador to the United States, said a divergence in values as much as policy is driving the two countries apart. He and 3 former UK ambassadors warned that future intelligence sharing with the top level of the current administration will become more and more difficult. What about Canada? Nope. Once our closest ally, Canada is now looking elsewhere. On March 17th, Canada and France entered into a new partnership sharing intelligence and security. Both the recent actions by Trump regarding trade, annexation, and our overall relationship, in conjunction with public acknowledgement of the signal fiasco, is driving Canada and other former allies away. Okay, there's Japan. And yet, Trump again fired off a broadside at Japan concerning our alliance, saying, "We have a great relationship with Japan, but we have an interesting deal with Japan that we have to protect them, but they don't have to protect us," Trump said Thursday. And by the way, they make a fortune with us economically. He said, "I actually ask who makes these deals." In response, a Japanese government spokesman said Friday that Japan trusts Washington to keep its obligation to the two countries' security treaty. Well, there's Mexico, right? Not so much. Trade, immigration, and drugs are straining an already tense relationship. Australia. Australia loves everybody, right? Yeah, it's not looking good. Dr. Emma Shortish, director of the International and Security Affairs Program at the Australia Institute, argues, quote, "It is Trump demonstrating once again that he has absolutely no care for how his actions affect the United States' traditional allies," end quote. I could go on, but really, is there a need? It's obvious that our traditional allies are recognizing the reality of their relationships with the United States under Trump. They're pivoting to a world where the United States is no longer a powerful ally or a broker of peace and stability. It is now a bringer of chaos and instability. It has transitioned from a country of similar morals to a transactional country that is only looking for what it can gain in any relationship. Our former allies are now looking to each other and beginning to cut the U.S. out of their dealings and plans. Well, Trump is just being Trump. He's flexing his muscle to get better deals with our allies, you might say. Besides, what do we need these allies for anyways? We're the strongest military in the world. We can do what we want. Well, let's look at that. We are a nuclear power, and it's been our nuclear umbrella that's prevented other countries from developing their own nuclear arsenal. And if we break this down to a diplomatic level, diplomats, right or wrong, have a language and process all of their own. Trump, in breaking these norms, is a bit like your dog biting you after years of fidelity. Maybe it is a one-off event, yet the trust has been broken, and now you look at Fido with suspicion. And then what if Fido not only bites you, but also a few of your closest friends? You begin to question if the dog is rabid or its temperament is deranged. It's no longer trustworthy. Is that trust ever recoverable, or is it time for Fido to cross the rainbow bridge? Okay, maybe that was the wrong analogy. But does it matter if we push away all of our allies? Yes. When the U.S. needs backing by our allies to attain our goals, those countries won't be there to help us. And then let's look at it on an economic level. In 2023, the United States welcomed 66.5 million international tourists. That's nearly 20% of the total population of the United States. If other countries begin cautioning their citizens on visiting the U.S., what will that do to our tourism industry? How much money is made by the U.S. companies exporting military hardware each year? Well, in 2023, the U.S. exported $238 billion in arms. That's 43% of total global arms exports. Also in 2023, the U.S. exported $65.3 billion in cars. In 2024, the U.S. exported $178.7 billion in agricultural products. And in 2023, the total value of U.S. exports reached $3.1 trillion. The impact of Trump's tariffs will bring disaster on our economy and the economy of the world. Will we lose all of those exports immediately? Probably not. There is a reliance on U.S. services, agriculture, and manufacturing that's not easily replaced, at least not immediately. But there will be a drop in commerce between the U.S. and its former allies. There are multiple articles demonstrating how there are customers of foreign governments and companies that are canceling contracts with American companies already. And this was before Trump's Day of Liberation on April 2nd, where he announced his tariffs. Now that I've said the terrible T word, let's look at how tariffs work. A tariff makes foreign products more expensive, encouraging customers to buy local. Tariffs also generate government revenue and can be used as leverage in trade negotiations. Unlike what Trump said prior to the election and what many Republicans believed, let's see who pays for these tariffs. So, importing companies, not the foreign manufacturers or countries themselves. They pay the tariffs to U.S. Customs. These costs are then passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. So essentially, we pay the tariffs. What is the impact on consumers? Analysts warn that new tariffs could push U.S. inflation from 2.9% to 4%, increasing costs for everyday items like cars, electronics, and food. For example, automakers have expressed concerns that these tariffs could lead to a sharp increase in vehicle prices. As former President Ronald Reagan cautioned in a 1987 radio address,
"My fellow Americans, Prime Minister Nakasone of Japan will be visiting me here at the White House next week. It's an important visit because while I expect to take up our relations with our good friend Japan, which overall remain excellent, recent disagreements between our two countries on the issue of trade will also be high on our agenda. As perhaps you've heard, last week I placed new duties on some Japanese products in response to Japan's inability to enforce their trade agreement with us on electronic devices called semiconductors. Now, imposing such tariffs or trade barriers and restrictions of any kind are steps that I am loath to take, and in a moment I'll mention the sound economic reasons for this, that over the long run such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. But the Japanese semiconductors were a special case. We had clear evidence that Japanese companies were engaging in unfair trade practices that violated an agreement between Japan and the United States. We expect our trading partners to live up to their agreements. As I've often said, our commitment to free trade is also a commitment to fair trade. But in imposing these tariffs, we were just trying to deal with a particular problem, not begin a trade war. So next week, I'll be giving Prime Minister Nakasone this same message. We want to continue to work cooperatively on trade problems and want very much to lift these trade restrictions as soon as evidence permits. We want to do this because we feel both Japan and the United States have an obligation to promote the prosperity and economic development that only free trade can bring. Now, that message of free trade is one I conveyed to Canada's leaders a few weeks ago, and it was warmly received there. Indeed, throughout the world, there's a growing realization that the way to prosperity for all nations is rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair and free competition. Now, there are sound historical reasons for this. For those of us who lived through the Great Depression, the memory of the suffering it caused is deep and searing. And today, many economic analysts and historians argue that high tariff legislation passed back in that period, called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, greatly deepened the Depression and prevented economic recovery. You see, at first, when someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. What eventually occurs is, first, homegrown industries start relying on government protection in the form of high tariffs. They stop competing and stop making the innovative management and technological changes they need to succeed in world markets. And then, while all this is going on, something even worse occurs. High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. The result is more and more tariffs, higher and higher trade barriers, and less competition. So soon, because of the prices made artificially high by inefficiency and poor management, people stop buying. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs. The memory of all this occurring back in the 30s made me determined when I came to Washington to spare the American people the protectionist legislation that destroys prosperity. Now, it hasn't always been easy. There are those in the Congress, just as there were back in the 30s, who want to go for the quick political advantage, who will risk America's prosperity for the sake of a short-term appeal to some special interest group, who forget that more than 5 million American jobs are directly tied to the foreign export business, and additional millions are tied to imports. Well, I've never forgotten those jobs, and on trade issues, by and large, we've done well. In certain select cases, like the Japanese semiconductors, we've taken steps to stop unfair practices against American products, but we've still maintained our basic long-term commitment to free trade and economic growth. So, with my meeting with Prime Minister Nakasone and the Venice Economic Summit coming up, it's terribly important not to restrict a president's options in such trade dealings with foreign governments. Unfortunately, some in the Congress are trying to do exactly that. I'll keep you informed on this dangerous legislation because it's just another form of protectionism, and I may need your help to stop it. Remember, America's jobs and growth are at stake. Until next week, thanks for listening and God bless you.
And let me reiterate one point from his address. Quote, "You see, at first, when someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes, for a short while, it works, but only for a short time." End quote. Reagan, the right's former hero, was against the use of tariffs unless other options were already exhausted. Trump, the right's new hero, said in response to rising costs for autos, quote, "I could care less," end quote. He continued, quote, "If you make your car in the United States, you're going to make a lot of money. If you don't, you're going to have to probably come to the United States. Because if you want to make your car in the United States, there is no tariff," end quote. This does not take into account that automobile manufacturing is now a global enterprise, requiring the import of various parts for manufacture. Even if the car is built in the U.S., there will be an impact of between $3,000 and $15,000 on new cars built in the U.S. Liberation Day, Trump's wonderful day for American citizens, has now come and went, with Trump placing tariffs on 185 countries worldwide. Let's see who's excluded from Trump's tariffs. Well, there's Russia, Belarus, Cuba, and North Korea. Now, a White House spokesperson said that Russia is not on the tariff list due to the extreme sanctions placed on the country in response to the Ukraine war, which has rendered trade between the two countries as zero. Yet, U.S.-Russian trade currently stands at $3.5 billion, far larger than other countries on the list being attacked with tariffs. Does something smell rotten in the state of Denmark? Doesn't this continue to say something about where Trump's loyalties lie? But a Russian asset wouldn't want to tank the American economy, you might proclaim. Yeah, Putin would definitely be heartbroken if the U.S. and the rest of the world went into a recession or depression. It would only place the rest of the world in the same bind that Russia is currently in. Economists predict an effective tax hike of $3,500 or more to the average American with these tariffs. The cost of food, clothing, housing, cars, electronics, sports equipment, appliances, essentially everything will go up to offset the cost of Trump's tariffs. This will increase tax revenue for the U.S., by $6 trillion over 10 years, per Peter Navarro, a White House aide. So where will these revenues go, do you think? Will it be used to pay off the national debt? Likely not. Will it be refunded to the average American? Oh, no way. Will it be used to offset the extreme tax cuts placed on the richest 1%? Ding, ding, ding. Bingo. That's where it'll go. In just over 72 days, the United States has transformed from a global leader into a country increasingly isolated from its allies, burdened by economic instability and openly disregarding the constitutional rights and due process protections that once defined it. The Trump administration's aggressive policies, ranging from restricting academic and professional visas to enacting sweeping tariffs, are not only eroding trust among international partners, but also threatening the very foundations of American democracy. As foreign governments issue travel warnings for the U.S. and allies seek new partnerships elsewhere, the economic and diplomatic consequences of this administration's actions are becoming undeniable. Meanwhile, the erosion of free speech and due process sets a dangerous precedent, one that could extend beyond non-citizens and eventually target American citizens themselves. At the heart of this crisis is a fundamental question. How much power should one administration have, one person have, to rewrite the rules of governance, trade, and personal freedoms? If we continue down this path unchecked, the cost will not just be measured in economic downturns or diplomatic losses, but in the very liberties that we have long defined as being of the United States. The warning signs are clear. It is up to us to decide whether to heed them before it is too late. Before we sign off, I want to mention the feat of endurance and fortitude accomplished by Senator Cory Booker this week. The senator took to the Senate floor on Monday night, and 25 hours and 5 minutes later, with no breaks, the 55-year-old finished speaking and limped off the floor. This sets the record for the longest continuous Senate floor speech in the chamber's history. It beats Strom Thurmond's previous record of 24 hours and 18 minutes that he accomplished in 1957 to filibuster the Civil Rights Act of that year. Senator Booker, unlike many who filibuster, stayed on topic throughout, refraining from reading the phone book or passages from children's books, as were previous strategies. Booker read from letters sent by constituents, quoted famous political icons, and provided a continuous stream of his beliefs in a better America. One of the quotes that the senator relayed was from Dr. King, and it resounds with me. Quote, "The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people." End quote. I refuse to be silent, and I hope that you feel the same. Our only hope is to continually combat the evils of this administration and those that would support it. I urge you to speak out. Tell us in the comments, what are you doing to fight back against Trump and his cronies? Thank you for listening to Radio Free North America. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe, share, comment, and stay tuned for more discussions on protecting our democracy. I'm J.D. Welton. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and as always, stay free.